Welcome back to Russian Khton. Today's story is about a brilliant surgeon, a brutal betrayal in Moscow, and the love that survived the freezing Siberian winter. Let's begin.
The smell of a sterile operating room is something that gets under your fingernails and stays there forever. It is a sharp, metallic blend of iodine, ozone, and the electric tang of coagulated blood. For Dr. Ekaterina Volkova, Katya to her friends, it was the smell of home. At 32, she was already considered a prodigy, a surgeon whose hands possessed a calm, flawless certainty. Her husband, Anton, had hands that sweated. Anton was a surgeon too, but he was what the hospital staff quietly called a papinkin synok, a daddy's boy. He lacked the instinct, the nerve, and the precision. He had coasted through medical school on expensive gifts and family connections. Katya had married him out of a blind, naive affection, mistaking his arrogant confidence for actual competence. The illusion shattered on a rainy Tuesday evening during a complex but routine abdominal resection. Anton was lead surgeon. Katya was assisting. 2 hours into the procedure, Anton grew impatient. His scalpel slipped. It was a millimeter's error, but a millimeter is a chasm in surgery. He clipped the descending aorta. The sterile field instantly flooded with crimson. The heart monitor's steady rhythm spiked into a frantic, terrifying shriek. Anton froze. He simply stepped back, his hands shaking, his eyes wide above his surgical mask, completely paralyzed by his own mediocrity. "Clamp! Suction!" Katya roared, shoving him out of the way, her hands diving into the pooling blood, desperately trying to find the retracted artery blindly, by touch. But Anton's hesitation had cost them 50 seconds of massive hemorrhage. The patient, a 50-year-old father of 3, flatlined on the table. What followed was a masterclass in Krugovaya Poruka, the ancient, unspoken Russian tradition of mutual cover-ups, where the corrupt collective protects its own. Anton did not face a medical tribunal. Instead, he went straight to the Glavrach, the chief medical officer. In a Russian state hospital, the Glavrach is not just an administrator, he is a feudal lord with absolute power over careers, salaries, and truths. The Glavrach had his own reasons to protect Anton. The next morning, Katya was summoned to the chief's office. Lying on the heavy oak desk was a doctored surgical protocol and forged patient charts. The signatures of the anesthesiologist and the scrub nurse had already been secured through threats of termination. The official narrative was written in cold, bureaucratic ink. Dr. Ekaterina Volkova had performed an unauthorized maneuver, causing a fatal rupture. "Sign it, Katya," Anton whispered, not meeting her eyes. He was sitting in the corner of the office, his expensive watch gleaming. "They'll just revoke your license. If I go down, there will be a criminal negligence trial. I'll go to a penal colony." "You killed a man," Katya said, her voice shaking with a rage so profound it tasted like copper. "And you want me to bury my life to save yours?" "Sign it," the Glavrach said smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. "Or I will personally ensure the police investigate this as deliberate malice. You will be in pre-trial detention by Friday." They cornered her. Under the suffocating threat of a fabricated criminal case, her spirit broke. She signed. The fallout was absolute. Katya was stripped of her medical license in a humiliating public hearing. Her name was added to the Ministry of Health's blacklists. Her reputation was incinerated. 3 days later, Anton filed for divorce. The final crushing blow came a week later when Katya saw Anton walking out of a high-end Moscow restaurant, his arm wrapped around Yana, the Glavrach's eldest daughter. The pieces violently clicked into place. Anton hadn't just been a coward, he had been sleeping with Yana for months. The botched surgery was merely a convenient excuse to discard his wife, appease his powerful new father-in-law, and secure his position. Katya was left with nothing. No profession, no husband, no name. A year later, the brilliant surgeon was washing an old man's feet in a cramped bathroom. Without a medical license, Katya had no choice but to work in the shadows. She took jobs as a sidelka, a private caregiver and live-in nurse for the elderly relatives of wealthy Moscow families. It was exhausting, invisible work, usually reserved for desperate migrants, but it paid enough to rent a tiny room on the outskirts of the city. It was late April. Katya had been hired as emergency medical support for a lavish charity gala hosted at a sprawling usadba, a historic aristocratic estate outside Moscow. Her job was to sit quietly in the staff corridor with a blood pressure monitor and a first aid kit, just in case an elderly patron drank too much champagne. In the main hall, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasting meats, and the clinking of crystal flutes. Suddenly, the classical quartet stopped playing. A woman screamed. Katya dropped her tea and ran into the hall. A man in a bespoke tuxedo was on the floor, surrounded by a panicked, useless circle of socialites. He was in his mid-40s, powerfully built, but right now, he was dying. His hands clutched his throat. His face was a terrifying mottled purple. His lips were swelling rapidly, expanding to twice their size. Katya knew immediately. Severe anaphylactic shock, otek kvinka, Quincke's edema. The tissues in his airway were rapidly swelling shut, suffocating him from the inside. "Step back!" Katya roared, her voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising authority of an operating room. The wealthy guests instinctively parted. She dropped to her knees beside the man. She checked his pulse, erratic, fading. She tried to open his mouth, but his throat was completely obstructed by the swollen tissue. He had seconds left before his brain suffered irreversible oxygen deprivation. "Where's the ambulance?" Katya shouted. "They're stuck in the traffic jam on the Rubliovka highway. 10 minutes, a panicked event manager yelled. 10 minutes was an eternity. He would be dead in 2. Katya's mind went icy clear. The panic vanished, replaced by the mechanical, flawless precision she thought had been stolen from her. She didn't have a scalpel. She didn't have an intubation tube. She had to rely on desperate improvisation. She grabbed a heavy, serrated steak knife from a nearby banquet table. From a waiter's breast pocket, she snatched a thick, hollow, plastic ballpoint pen, snapping off the ink cartridge. "Hold his head back! Keep his neck taut!" she barked at a stunned security guard. Katya didn't hesitate. She palpated the man's neck, her sensitive fingertips instantly locating the small indentation between the thyroid and cricoid cartilages. She poured a glass of high-proof vodka over his neck and her own hands. With a swift, steady motion, she made a precise vertical incision through the skin, then a horizontal puncture through the cricothyroid membrane. Dark blood welled up, but Katya ignored it, forcefully inserting the hollow plastic tube of the pen into the airway. A sharp, wet hiss filled the room. The man's chest heaved. He sucked in a massive, ragged breath through the pen tube. The purple hue began to recede from his face. He was breathing. When the paramedics finally rushed through the doors 8 minutes later, they froze in absolute shock. They saw a woman in a cheap gray staff uniform, maintaining a perfect, textbook improvised cricothyrotomy, keeping a billionaire alive with a steak knife and a piece of plastic. The man's name was Vadim. He was a self-made titan of industry, a man who had survived the lawless, brutal 1990s of Russian capitalism and emerged as a billionaire with an iron will and a deep disdain for incompetence. A week after the gala, a black SUV pulled up to the dilapidated concrete apartment block where Katya rented her room. 2 enormous men in dark suits politely but firmly escorted her to Vadim's private estate, a modern fortress hidden behind high brick walls in an elite forest enclave. Vadim was sitting in a wheelchair in his vast, sunlit library, recovering from the ordeal. His neck was bandaged, but his eyes were sharp, calculating and entirely lucid. "My security team did a background check on you, Ekaterina," Vadim said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He poured 2 cups of tea. "The official medical registry says you are a disgraced butcher who killed a patient due to sheer incompetence." Katya looked away, her jaw tightening. "Then why did you bring me here? To thank a butcher?" "Because," Vadim said softly, "I know what a panicked butcher looks like, and I know what a master looks like. The paramedics told me that what you did on that floor required the nerves of a sniper in the hands of a god. The woman who saved my life does not make amateur mistakes." Katya stared at him, the heavy armor around her heart cracking just a fraction. For the first time in a year, someone saw the truth. She looked at her scarred hands and slowly, haltingly, she told him everything. She told him about Anton, the torn aorta, the glavrach, and the suffocating blackmail that stole her life. Vadim listened in absolute silence. When she finished, his face was carved from granite. "I have a proposition," Vadim said. "I have a chronic spinal injury, an old bullet shrapnel fragment embedded near my lumbar vertebrae from an assassination attempt in the 90s. The fragment cannot be safely removed, and it periodically triggers excruciating, paralyzing nerve spasms that require constant, discreet medical management. I despise state hospitals, and I trust private clinics even less. I want you to be my personal, secret physician. You will live here on the estate. In exchange, I pay you a fortune. And more importantly," he leaned forward, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity, "I will unleash my lawyers and my security apparatus. We will dig up the ghosts. We will clear your name." Katya took the job. Over the next 6 months, the vast, echoing spaces of Vadim's estate became a sanctuary. Katya managed his pain, guided his physical therapy, and slowly, the professional boundary between them began to blur. They spent long autumn evenings sitting by the roaring fireplace, drinking tea from a heavy, ornate samovar. Katya learned that behind Vadim's ruthless corporate facade was a man of profound loneliness and surprising tenderness. He listened to her talk about the intricacies of cardiovascular surgery with genuine fascination. Vadim, in turn, found himself captivated by her quiet strength, her unyielding dignity. It wasn't a sudden explosion of passion. It was a slow, inevitable thawing of two frozen souls. When they finally kissed, standing on the rainy terrace overlooking the dark pine forest, it felt like coming home. Vadim promised her the world. He promised her justice, but the ghosts of Katya's past were not done with her. By late November, the Glavrach, Anton's powerful father-in-law, was in trouble. He had been quietly embezzling state funds from his hospital for years, but an impending federal audit threatened to expose his massive financial black hole. He desperately needed a colossal private investment to cover his tracks. He targeted Vadim. Vadim, knowing the man had destroyed Katya, coldly and publicly rejected the investment proposal. Desperate, the Glavrach resorted to his final card, his younger daughter, Alina. Alina was 22, a classic Moscow Majorca, a spoiled child of the elite who drove a Porsche and treated people like disposable napkins. Her father ordered her to seduce Vadim, to secure the billionaire by any means necessary. But Vadim, deeply in love with Katya, ignored Alina's blatant advances. So, Alina took matters into her own hands. It happened at a massive corporate New Year's banquet in late December. Vadim attended out of obligation. Katya, wanting to keep their relationship out of the tabloids until her name was cleared, stayed at the estate. During the banquet, Alina cornered Vadim at the bar. While he was distracted by a business associate, she slipped a highly concentrated, fast-acting sedative, stolen from her father's surgical ward, into his glass of whiskey. Vadim remembered finishing the drink. His next memory was waking up 12 hours later in a luxurious hotel suite, his head splitting with a narcotic hangover. Lying naked next to him in the bed was Alina, smiling a predatory, triumphant smile. Vadim was horrified. He immediately threw her out, rushed back to the estate, and confessed everything to Katya. He swore on his life that he remembered nothing, that he had been drugged. Katya, knowing the viciousness of that family, believed him. They tightened their circle and prepared to fight, but a month later, Alina dropped the nuclear bomb. She arrived at the estate flanked by her father. She threw a heavy medical folder onto Vadim's desk. Inside were flawless, officially stamped laboratory blood tests and a sonogram image. "I'm pregnant," Alina said, her eyes flashing with venomous triumph. "And you, Vadim, are going to do the honorable thing and marry me and invest in my father's clinic. Or I will go to the press and tell the world how you took advantage of a young girl and abandoned your child." Vadim was furious, demanding independent tests, but Katya, standing in the shadows of the library, felt the world collapse around her. She picked up the ultrasound scan. She read the hormonal blood panels. They were perfect. They bore the official seal of the state laboratory. As a doctor, Katya knew how to read the undeniable biological truth of a growing life. Vadim grabbed Katya's hands. "Katya, it's a lie. It has to be a lie. I was unconscious. I will destroy them. I will prove—" "Vadim, look at the HCG levels," Katya whispered, her voice entirely hollow, tears spilling over her eyelashes. It's real. There is a child. In the Russian soul, there is a deep, tragic reverence for sacrifice. Katya was a doctor. She had sworn an oath to preserve life. The thought of a child growing up without a father, born into a war zone of lawsuits and scandals, repulsed her moral core. She could not build her fragile happiness on the broken foundation of an innocent baby's life. You have to take responsibility, Vadim. Katya sobbed, pulling her hands from his grasp. It's a child. It's an innocent life. I can't be the reason you abandon your blood. Katya, no. Don't do this. Don't let them win. Vadim pleaded, desperation cracking his stoic facade. But Katya was already walking away. That night, while Vadim was in a meeting with his crisis management team, Katya packed a single duffel bag. She knew that buying a plane or train ticket with her passport would instantly trigger an alert in the magistral federal database, allowing Vadim's security team to intercept her at any station in Russia within hours. So, she went entirely off the grid. She took a bus to the outskirts of Moscow, walked to a massive truck stop on the highway, and paid cash to Dalnoboyshchiki, long-haul truckers, to hitch rides across the freezing expanse of the country. She left no digital footprint. She cut every tie to her past. She needed to disappear. She needed to go somewhere so remote, so punishing, that the pain in her chest would simply freeze over. She chose the Glubinka. By late January, Katya was living at the edge of the world. She had traveled thousands of kilometers to a remote, snow-buried village in the Krasnoyarsk region of Siberia. It was a place of staggering, brutal beauty, where the dark, endless taiga met the frozen Yenisei River. The temperature frequently dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The air was so cold it burned the lungs, and the only smell was wood smoke from the brick pechkas heating the small wooden cabins. Officially, her disqualified status and blacklisted name meant she couldn't even touch a thermometer in a state medical facility without triggering a criminal check in the Federal Register of Medical Workers. So, she took a job as a sanitarka, a lowly janitor and basic orderly, in the village's FAP, Feldsher Midwife Station. It was a tiny, drafty wooden clinic with peeling paint and a severely depleted medicine cabinet. The actual rural practitioner was a 70-year-old local man with failing eyesight and trembling hands. Officially, Katya just mopped the freezing floors and washed the bedpans for minimum wage. Unofficially, she was the ghost running the clinic. She diagnosed the loggers' chainsaw wounds, palpated abdomens for appendicitis, and calculated complex antibiotic dosages, while the old Feldsher silently signed the official paperwork, profoundly grateful for the miracle of her capable hands. She lived in a small log cabin, with a stray dog she had rescued from the snow. In the evenings, she would sit by the roaring fire of her pechka, drinking cheap black tea from a chipped mug, listening to the howling blizzards and trying absolutely, desperately, not to think about Vadim. She had chosen exile to save a child's family. It was a noble sacrifice, but it felt like a slow death. 2,000 kilometers away in Moscow, Vadim had not surrendered. He was a man who had built an empire by tearing down obstacles with his bare hands. The moment Katya disappeared, he didn't mourn. He went to war. He unleashed his private Sluzhba Bezopasnosti, a security service composed of former intelligence officers who operated with terrifying efficiency. Tear their lives down to the studs, Vadim commanded his head of security. Find me the truth. The security team moved like ghosts. Within a week, they found the waiter who had served Vadim at the banquet. A briefcase full of cash and a subtle threat of physical violence produced a signed confession and security camera footage of Alina slipping the sedative into the glass. Next, Vadim targeted Alina. In modern Moscow, with its omnipresent facial recognition cameras and digital surveillance, throwing someone into a van was a crude relic of the 90s. Billionaires had more elegant, inescapable methods. Vadim's men simply bypassed the security of Alina's elite underground parking garage. When she unlocked her Porsche Cayenne, Vadim was already sitting calmly in the passenger seat. In the back sat a discreet, Swiss-trained phlebotomist and a thick dossier outlining every single offshore embezzlement network her father operated. Faced with the immediate choice between a quiet blood draw right there in the car or her father spending the next decade in the Lefortovo high-security prison. Alina broke down. The blood draw confirmed what Vadim had suspected. HCG levels were absolute zero. There was no pregnancy. The ultrasound and the state laboratory reports had been entirely fabricated by her father, the Glavrach, to force the marriage and extort Vadim's millions. But Vadim wasn't done. He wanted total annihilation. His detectives scoured the slums of Moscow until they found Marina, the scrub nurse who had been present during Anton's fatal surgery. Driven to the brink by the Glavrach's constant threats and living in a crumbling Khrushchevka apartment, Marina was terrified. Vadim offered her absolute protection, relocation, and a small fortune. Marina handed over the original, unaltered surgical notes she had secretly photocopied before the Glavrach forced her to sign the forged ones. The notes detailed Anton's lethal mistake and Katya's desperate, flawless attempt to save the patient. Vadim took the entire mountain of compromat, the compromising material, directly to the federal prosecutor's office. The hammer fell with apocalyptic force. Federal agents raided the state hospital. The Glavrach was dragged out in handcuffs in front of the local news cameras, charged with massive embezzlement, medical fraud, and extortion. Anton, weeping and begging for mercy, was arrested for criminal medical negligence and conspiracy. Alina was charged with blackmail. Their lives were entirely, permanently destroyed in a matter of 48 hours. With his enemies vanquished, Vadim turned to his final task, finding Katya. For weeks, his men had chased ghosts because Katya had traveled entirely off the grid, but they finally caught a microscopic, unavoidable slip-up. The old, half-blind feldsher in the Siberian village had fallen severely ill with pneumonia. Desperate, Katya had been forced to travel 50 kilometers to a regional pharmacy and use her own passport to sign for a restricted, life-saving batch of antibiotics. The moment her name hit the database, Vadim was in the air. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The Siberian sky was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening another massive snowfall. The temperature had plunged to minus 42 degrees. Katya was standing outside the FAP clinic, wearing heavy felt Valenki boots and a thick sheepskin coat, chopping firewood with an old axe. The physical exertion was the only thing that kept the memories at bay. She swung the axe, burying it into a birch log, her breath pluming in the freezing air like dragon smoke. Suddenly, a strange, rhythmic thumping echoed over the tops of the pine trees. It wasn't a tractor. It was too fast, too loud. The village dogs began to bark frantically. Katya dropped the axe, shielding her eyes against the glare of the snow. Over the tree line, a massive, sleek, black helicopter emerged, its rotor blades whipping up a localized blizzard of blinding white powder. The villagers, who usually only saw helicopters when the emergency medevac arrived once a year, poured out of their cabins, staring in awe. The helicopter slowly descended, landing in the large, snow-covered clearing right in front of Katya's clinic. The engine whined down, the rotors slowing. The side door slid open. A man stepped out into the knee-deep snow. He wore a tailored, expensive cashmere overcoat that looked entirely alien against the rugged Siberian backdrop. It was Vadim. Katya stopped breathing. The world spun. She took a step backward, her hand flying to her mouth, convinced the isolation had finally shattered her mind and she was hallucinating. Vadim walked through the snow toward her, his dark eyes locked onto hers with a fierce, unwavering intensity. He didn't care about the freezing cold, but as he took his fourth step, his body betrayed him. The brutal, constant vibration of the long helicopter flight, combined with the sudden, shocking drop to extreme sub-zero temperatures, hit him like a physical blow. The old 90s shrapnel embedded near his lumbar vertebrae shifted, triggering a massive, agonizing nerve spasm. Vadim's leg gave out completely. He stumbled, falling heavily to one knee in the deep snow, a sharp gasp of sheer agony escaping his lips as his hand flew to his lower back. The villagers gasped. His security detail rushed forward from the helicopter, but Katya didn't hesitate. The terrified exile vanished, and the brilliant, uncompromising surgeon instantly took over. She sprinted through the snow, dropping to her knees beside him. "Vadim!" She caught his broad shoulders, her expert hands instinctively finding the rigid, rock-hard muscle knots along his lumbar spine. "Don't move! Help me get him inside!" She barked at his heavily armed bodyguards, her voice ringing with absolute authority. They carried the billionaire into the drafty, peeling wooden clinic, laying him face down on the single, squeaky examination bed. Katya moved with flawless precision. She didn't have her VIP clinic tools, but she had her profound medical knowledge. From the meager village supplies, she rapidly prepared a highly specific, potent, muscle-relaxing cocktail. "Breathe through the pain," Katya ordered, her hands steady as stone as she palpated his spine, finding the exact millimeter where the nerve cluster was trapped by the inflamed tissue. She administered the injection perfectly. Within 3 minutes, the agonizing, paralyzing tension began to drain from Vadim's face. His breathing slowed. He let out a ragged, trembling exhale, turning his head to look up at the woman who had just saved him. Again, "You are a very difficult woman to find, Dr. Volkova," Vadim whispered hoarsely, a faint, exhausted smile touching his lips. "Vadim," Katya breathed, tears instantly freezing on her eyelashes as she checked his pulse. "The baby. You have to go back. You have a family." "There is no baby, Katya," Vadim said, slowly pushing himself up to sit on the edge of the examination bed. The pain was receding, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief. There never was. It was a lie, a fabrication to hide her father's crimes. Katya froze, her hands hovering in the air, her mind struggling to process the words. "A lie? But the blood tests. I saw them." "Forged," Vadim said smoothly. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a thick, official leather folder embossed with the golden seal of the Ministry of Health. He held it out to her. "What is this?" Katya asked, her hands trembling so violently she could barely take the folder. "That," Vadim said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the full, legal restoration of your medical license." The scrub nurse testified. "Anton and the Glavroch are sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial. They will never touch a scalpel or a patient again. Your name is cleared, Katya. You are vindicated." Katya opened the folder. She saw the crisp official certificate. She saw her name. The heavy, suffocating weight she had carried for over a year. The humiliation, the injustice, the crushing exile suddenly shattered. A sob ripped from her throat, raw and agonizing. Vadim stood up, his spine straight once more. He closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. Katya dropped the folder onto the linoleum floor and clung to his coat, weeping with a joy so profound it physically hurt. "I told you I would clear your name," Vadim whispered into her ear. "I told you I would protect you." He pulled back just enough to look into her tear-streaked face, then slowly, right there in the peeling, drafty Siberian clinic that she had ruled like a ghost, the billionaire dropped to one knee. From his pocket, Vadim produced a small velvet box. He flipped it open, revealing a diamond that caught the pale winter light filtering through the frosted window. "I promised you justice," Vadim said, looking up at her, his eyes shining with absolute, undeniable love. "Now I am asking for your life. Come home with me, Katya. Marry me. Let's go build a hospital of our own." Katya looked at the man kneeling before her. She looked at the tiny clinic, the taiga outside, and the long, bitter road of her exile. The winter was finally over. "Yes," Katya laughed, falling to her knees right in front of him, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, take me home."
Even in the coldest taiga, justice finds a way. The betrayal is answered, and the winter is finally over. Thank you for watching. See you in next video.